Chapter 9. I shall not bore you with repetition. My second year was pretty much like my first, with the same finale. Ditto for the third. Rain came twice that second year, with a basket of goodies and a mouthful of gossip. Both times I forbade him ever to come again. The third year, he came down 6 times, every other month, and each time I forbade him anew and ate his food and heard what he had to say. Something was wrong in Amber. Strange things walked through shadow and presented themselves, with violence, to all and sundry. They were destroyed, of course. Eric was still trying to figure out how they had occurred. I did not mention my curse, though I later rejoiced in the fact that it had come to pass. Random, like myself, was still a prisoner. His wife had joined him. The positions of my older brothers and sisters remained unchanged. This bolstered me through the 3rd anniversary of the coronation, and it made me feel almost alive again. One day it was there, and it made me feel so good that I immediately broke out the final bottle of wine Rain had brought me, and opened the last pack of cigarettes, which I had been saving. I smoked them and sipped and enjoyed the feeling that I had somehow beaten Eric. If he found this out, I felt it might be fatal. But I knew he didn't know. So I rejoiced, smoking, drinking, and reveling in the light of that which had occurred. Yes, the light. I'd discovered a tiny patch of brightness off somewhere to my right. Well, let's take it like this. I had awakened in a hospital bed and learned that I had recovered all too soon, dig? I heal faster than others who had been broken. All the lords and ladies of Amber have something of this capacity. I'd lived through the plague. I'd lived through the March on Moscow. I regenerate faster and better than anybody I've ever known. Napoleon had once made a remark about it, so had General MacArthur. With nerve tissue, it takes me a bit longer. That's all. My sight was returning to me. That's what it meant. That lovely patch of brightness off somewhere to my right. After a time, I knew it was the little barren area in the door to my cell. I had grown new eyes, my fingers told me. It had taken me over 3 years, but I had done it. It was the 1,000,001 thing I spoke of earlier, the thing which even Eric could not properly assess because of the variances of powers among the individual members of the family. I had beaten him to this extent. I had learned that I could grow new eyeballs. I had always known that I could regenerate nerve tissues given sufficient time. I had been left paraplegic from a spine injury reserved during the Franco-Prussian Wars. After 2 years, it had gone away. I had had my hope, a wild one, I'll admit, that I could do what I had done then with my burned-out orbs. And I had been right. They felt intact, and the sight was returning, slowly. How long till the next anniversary of Eric's coronation? I stopped pacing and my heart beat faster. As soon as someone saw that I'd recovered my eyes, I'd lose them again. Therefore, I'd have to escape before the 4 years had passed. How? I hadn't thought about it much up to this time, because even if I could figure a way to get out of my cell, I'd never make it out of Amber, or out of the palace for that matter, without eyes or aid, and neither were available to me. Now, though, the door of my cell was a big, heavy, brass-bound thing with only a tiny grill at a height of about 5 feet for purposes of looking in to see whether I was still alive, if anyone cared. Even if I succeeded in removing it, I could tell that I couldn't reach out far enough to touch the lock. There was a little swinging gate at the bottom of the door, large enough to push my food through, and that's about all. The hinges were either on the outside or in between the door and the jamb. I couldn't tell for sure. Either way, I couldn't get at them. There were no windows and no other doors. It was still almost like being blind, save for that feeble, reassuring light through the grill. I knew my sight hadn't returned fully, that was still a long way off. But even if it had, it was nearly pitch dark in there. I knew this because I knew the dungeons under Amber. I lit a cigarette, paced some more, and assessed my possessions, seeking anything that might be of aid. There was my clothing, my sleeping mat, and all the damp straw I wanted. I also had matches, but I quickly rejected the notion of setting fire to the straw. I doubted anyone would come and open the door if I did. Most likely the guard would come and laugh if he came at all. I had a spoon I'd picked up at the last banquet. I'd wanted a knife, really, but Julian had caught me trying to lift one and snatched it away. What he didn't know, though, was that that was my second attempt. I already had the spoon tucked inside my boot. So what good was it? I'd heard these stories of guys digging their way out of cells with the damnedest things, belt buckles, which I didn't have, etc. But I didn't have time to try the Count of Monte Cristo bit. I needed out in a matter of months, or my new eyes wouldn't mean anything. The door was mainly wood, oak. It was bound with 4 metal strips. One went around it near the top, one near the bottom, right above the gate, and there were 2 which ran from top to bottom, passing along either side of the foot-wide grill. The door opened outward, I knew, and the lock was to my left. My memories told me that the door was about 2 inches thick, and I recalled the approximate position of the lock, which I verified by leaning against the door and feeling the tension at that point. I knew that the door was also barred, but I could worry about that later. I might be able to raise it by sliding the handle of the spoon upward between the door's edge and the jamb. I knelt on my sleeping mat, and with the spoon I traced a box about that area which contained the lock. I worked until my hand was quite sore, maybe a couple of hours. Then I ran my fingernail over the surface of the wood. I hadn't scarred it much, but it was a beginning. I switched the spoon to my left hand and continued until it began to ache. I kept hoping that Rain would show up. I was sure I could talk him into giving me his dagger if I really pressed the matter. He didn't put in an appearance, though, so I just kept grinding away. Day after day I worked until I was perhaps half an inch into the wood. Each time I'd hear a guard's footsteps, I'd move the pallet back to the far wall and lie down on it with my back to the door. When he had passed, I'd resume work. Then I had to stop for a while, much as I hated to. Even though I had wrapped them in cloth torn from my garments, my hand had blisters, and the blisters had broken, and after a time, the raw flesh underneath began to bleed. So I took a break to let them heal. I decided to devote the time to planning what I'd do after I got out. When I'd worked my way far enough through the door, I'd raise the bar. The sound of it falling would probably bring a guard. By then, though, I'd be out. A couple of good kicks would break out the piece I was working on, and the lock could stay right where it was if it wanted to. The door would swing open then, and I would face the guard. He would be armed, and I wouldn't. I'd have to take him. He might be overconfident, thinking I couldn't see. On the other hand, he might be a bit afraid if he recalled how I had entered into Amber. Either way, he would die, and I would then be armed. I gripped my right bicep with my left hand, and my fingertips touched. Gods, I was emaciated. Whatever. I was of the blood of Amber, and I felt that even in that condition I could take on any ordinary man. Maybe I was kidding myself, but I'd have to try it. Then if I succeeded, with a blade in my hand, nothing could keep me from reaching the pattern. I'd walk it, and when I made it to the center, I could transport myself to any shadow world I chose. There I would recuperate, and this time I would not rush things. If it took me a century, I'd have everything letter perfect before I moved against Amber again. After all, I was technically its liege. Hadn't I crowned myself in the presence of all before Eric had done the same? I'd make good my claim to the throne. If only it weren't impossible to walk into shadow from Amber itself, and I wouldn't have to fool around with the pattern. But my Amber is the center of all, and you don't just depart it that easily. After, say, a month, my hands had healed, and I was developing large calluses from my scraping activities. I heard a guard's footsteps and removed myself to the far side of the cell. There was a brief creak, and my meal was slipped beneath the door. Then there were footsteps again, this time diminishing in the distance. I returned to the door. Without looking, I knew what was on the tray. A chunk of stale bread, a crock of water, and a piece of cheese if I was lucky. I positioned the mat, knelt on it, and felt at the groove. I was about halfway through. Then I heard the chuckle. It came from behind me.